The Sacred Purge, tracing modernity's religious roots.
Most people think modernity came from the great success of science, leaving the religious past completely. But some thinkers say modernity was not a split. They claim it just took old sacred ideas away from God and gave them to nature and man. Modernity only changed the name on the old structure. Was modernity a complete rupture, or just a reinterpretation of traditional method? We will now begin a long journey to understand this. The reason for this lies in the faith's founding characteristic. Unlike many other major historical movements, Jesus offered the spiritual essence, but he didn't give a full socio-political rule book. This absence was not a mistake. It was the ultimate source of the Church's long-term adaptability. It immediately created a fundamental theological vacuum that the early community was forced to fill. This gaping void established the single, ironclad rule that would govern the Church through every subsequent crisis for 2 millennia. The rule was this: the spiritual message, the essence, must remain absolute and untouched, but the institutional structures, the laws, the governance, the entire organizational form that had to be continuously adapted, sacrificed, or completely changed according to the era. It is this foundational characteristic, this necessary flexibility, that explains how Christianity, born in a small province, was able to survive empires, revolutions, and the birth of the scientific age. The application of this foundational rule, the essence must remain, the form must be disposable, began immediately with the Apostles. Their first challenge was existential: to evolve from a small Jewish sect into a truly universal faith. First, St. Paul executed the first radical act of reinterpretation. He faced the core theological conflict by separating the message of salvation from the law's cultural form, specifically circumcision and the dietary codes. But he succeeded in defining the faith's timeless theological essence. Salvation comes through faith alone. This action liberated the core message from its original cultural shell. Simultaneously, St. Peter established the institutional form. He focused his efforts on creating the governing hierarchy, the structure needed for discipline and growth, and, crucially, designating Rome as the geographic center. This duality created the primary mechanism for all future adaptability. Paul provided the eternal spiritual compass, while Peter provided the temporary, disposable political structure. This mechanism ensured that, regardless of the crisis, the essence remains. The form is disposable. The Church had a rule that would shape its future. The essence remains, but the form can change. With this guiding principle, it set out to build a lasting structure. The Apostolic age had left a void, a gap in organization. To manage a rapidly growing faith across a vast empire, the Church looked to the only model that had proven effective: Rome itself. It embraced Rome's organizational logic completely. The diocese system became the blueprint for territorial governance, mapping bishoprics onto the empire's provinces. The title of Pontifex Maximus, once the emperor's own religious office, was adapted to establish the pope's centralized authority. One leader, one structure, one unified church. By adopting Rome's form, the Church transformed into a highly structured institution governed by its own laws, and in doing so, it secured its survival, maintaining continuity even as the Roman Empire itself crumbled around it. Even as the Roman Empire fell, the Church survived. It kept the knowledge of Roman law and administration, which became its backbone. But Rome's fall created a big problem, a gap in political power. The Church stepped into this gap. Its goal was simple: protect its core beliefs while adapting to the changing world. Through the Pope, it brought together spiritual and political power, guiding kings and managing lands across Western Europe. At the same time, the Church adapted intellectually. Thinkers like St. Thomas Aquinas combined Christian faith with the ideas of Aristotle, creating Scholasticism. This helped people understand faith through reason. By doing this, the Church became powerful both in politics and in ideas. It ruled the lands and shaped the minds of people, becoming the most important authority in medieval Europe. The synthesis of political and intellectual power had brought the Church to its zenith. However, this very power contained the seeds of its destruction. The ultimate crisis came when the institutional form, the papacy, itself became corrupted by wealth and temporal authority. The Reformation was a fundamental rebellion, but it was executed using the Church's own core principle: sacrifice the form to preserve the essence. Martin Luther was the individual who executed this sacrifice. His radical action was to strip all authority from the institutional hierarchy. By asserting the three solas, sola scriptura and sola fide, he declared that salvation did not come through the Church's corrupt mechanisms, but through faith and Scripture alone. This was not just theology. It was the ultimate act of deinstitutionalization. Authority was taken from the centralized power, the papacy, and transferred directly to the individual conscience and the sacred text. This internal revolution was the necessary precondition for the modern age. By sacrificing the institutional form, the Church unintentionally opened the intellectual path for massive individualism and rational inquiry. The era of centralized religious control was over, paving the way for the secular state. We have followed the rebellion of form, but the final crisis was the most severe. This time, even the essence itself was shaken. All familiar doctrines were overthrown, and the foundations of theology were fractured. Religion was rapidly being replaced by science. The fundamental question of the new era was existential. What methodology will guide this radically new world? At this final juncture, Christianity's historical expertise in adaptation revealed itself as sacred transference. The solution was not just to adapt the form, but to systematically transfer the attributes and power of the old God to new secular structures. The crisis was existential. The traditional Christian God and Church are gone. Who will inherit the power of the divine? The answer was a systematic sacred transference, replacing the spiritual attributes with rational ones, the transfer of divinity to logic. God's supernatural power was transferred to the mechanical, unchangeable laws of nature. The universe ceased being a theater of divine intervention and became a predictable machine, ruled entirely by physics. Crucially, God's ethical authority was also transferred to the rational human conscience, making man the final judge of morality. The transfer of absolute authority. The ultimate political authority was transferred from the Church to the national state. The state became the new secular sovereign, inheriting the very same claim to absolute centralized authority that the papacy had forged in the Middle Ages. The political power of the Church was liquidated. The transfer of purpose. Even the deepest religious longings were repackaged. Philosophers like Marx and Hegel repurposed the religious promise of salvation, eschatology, into historical progress and the classless society. The spiritual quest was replaced by an inevitable worldly achievement. The 19th century is the ultimate example of the person-centered adaptation method. Europe successfully reproduced itself by sacrificing the traditional religious form, but by using the logical template of Christianity to create its powerful secular successor.